What evil lurks in the minds of men and women? The dark web knows. Just what is the dark web? Do you remember when you were a kid and you'd go out in the backyard and turn up all of the stones just to see what kind of creepy crawly things were underneath? Well, the dark web is that and so much more. It's like a farmer's market. Instead of fruits and vegetables, though, cyber criminals sell everything from identities to child pornography to drugs and state secrets even. There's so much information about the dark web that we've done 2 podcasts. And in today's second podcast on the dark web, we dig deep into what is the largest layer of online criminality today.
Malicious software.
The robots are coming.
They say we are not prepared.
Spying, snooping.
It's scary.
Hi, I'm attorney Stephen Tepler, and welcome to the Cyber Law Now podcast. I chair the cybersecurity and privacy practice at the law firm of Mandelbaum Salzberg. Here at Cyber Law Now, we'll discuss today's cybersecurity issues, make you aware of how they affect you and your family, and what you can do to protect yourself. Today, for the second time in our second podcast on the dark web, we're again fortunate to have as today's guest cybersecurity expert Jake Simpson, who is a dark web investigative expert as well with the Silent Group, a cybersecurity firm in Sarasota, Florida. Jake, I know you've told us about what you do during our last podcast, but fill us in a little bit more about what it is you do in your day-to-day activities exploring and investigating the dark web.
Hey, Stephen, thanks once again for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. So kind of my day-to-day really includes various cyber threat intelligence operations. Whether that's, I have a request from a client to go look and see if their data is on there or any of their clients' data is on there, all the way to assisting various law enforcement agencies in their investigations that they have. It really just depends. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love about my job is no 2 days are the same.
So what's interesting about what you just said is that you help out law enforcement in their investigation. Don't they have these huge NCIS type cybersecurity centers that they can rely on themselves?
It really depends on the level of law enforcement. However, the answer is no. A lot of times, local municipalities and sometimes even state municipality law enforcements will not have the kind of expertise or manpower to kind of deal with some of these investigations. And then on the federal level, it kind of comes down to do they really have the resources and the time to spend actually doing something like this? Of course, they could do it, but do they have the knowledge and the expertise and the inside into some of these highly exclusive and secretive kind of areas of the dark web?
So I noticed that I think you spoke during our last podcast about shadow brokers, and if you didn't, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what shadow brokers means and what they are, or it is.
Well, so that's a really good question, Stephen. And the shadow brokers are really kind of an enigmatic group. They essentially the skinny on them is that they're a group that is purported to have leaked NSA secrets and kind of shined a light on some areas where the light shouldn't have been shined on.
Care to go into any detail on that?
Nobody really knows who they are. They just kind of market themselves as a collective, a group, if you will. But they have uncovered some pretty interesting things as far as some classified data that they were able to get their hands on and release to the public. And since we're talking about the dark web, one of the interesting pieces to come out of the shadow brokers vault, if you will, was an NSA program codenamed Egotistical Draft, which was an exploit kind of targeted towards the outdated Firefox browser version that was at one time bundled with the Tor package. Now, the reason why that's important is, that actively shows that there is work being conducted on de-anonymizing the dark web, and it's far-reaching impacts, if you will.
So would it be fair to say that there isn't, or maybe there can never be, complete anonymity, even using something like a Tor browser and the dark web?
I would argue that there could potentially be a state where you could achieve pure being completely anonymous, if you will. However, a lot of that is not necessarily the technology, but how you personally conduct yourself and how you manage your own what's called OPSEC, or operational security. So if you're using kind of burner identities, burner things that you can just kind of toss away every time you want to go do something, then yeah, you have a fairly reasonable shot at staying anonymous. But a lot of times where people will mess up is they'll leave a handle on a forum that's associated with a malware campaign that they were running, or they'll leave an email within their code of some cryptocurrency mining malware that they've written and that they're distributing and trying to sell, and generally those fall under the OPSEC fails, as we call them, where poor operational security is what leads to the apprehension and in some cases conviction of cyber criminals, not the technology piece. However, as we saw before, there's active operations ongoing to try to make the technology piece be the root cause for somebody's arrest in these investigations.
So it sounds like there is a game of leapfrog going on between law enforcement and legitimate investigation on the one end, and the criminal element, or the element who just wishes to never identify themselves, on the other.
Really, I would say it's more of a cat and mouse kind of game, where, for instance, law enforcement will be trying to chase this particular criminal, and they have, a lead, essentially, if you'll call it that, leads them to another potential lead, and it's kind of the shell game, if you will, of criminals trying to stay one step ahead of law enforcement and remain anonymous within their dealings on the dark web.
That's great. When we come back, we'll talk more about criminal activity on the dark web, what it means for the everyday person, how it affects us every day and in every way. And we'll hear more of this from Jake Simpson from the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida, when we return. Welcome back to Cyber Law Now. I'm Steve Tepler, and I have with me Jake Simpson from the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida, a cybersecurity and dark web investigative expert who has been giving us the intel on what happens in the dark web, who uses it, why they use it, and some common misconceptions about what the dark web's all about. We talked about before the break, Jake, the fact that there's a leapfrog or a cat and mouse game between law enforcement on the one hand, legitimate use of the dark web on one hand, and criminality or criminal elements or less than white hat type elements on the other. Does the technology used in dark web access and communication get better and then get compromised, or get, I guess the way I would put it is, does it get better at anonymizing, and then does law enforcement get better at de-anonymizing it over time?
Well, certainly that, really that's the case in the name of the game in a lot of cybersecurity aspects today. Things are released, and there's some researcher that will come along and find something wrong with it, and then the developer or the creator of this software or hardware piece or computer or whatever it may be they'll release a patch or they'll update it, and it's this constant, kind of the same cat and mouse game that we had with law enforcement trying to catch criminals, but it's also the same with security vulnerabilities being inherently present within the technology to access the dark web, and then the researchers who are finding it and reporting it to either law enforcement or keeping it for their own selves and kind of monetizing it that way, or doing the good thing and reporting it. But certainly there's definitely a lot of that occurs.
And what is the difference between using, let's say, a VPN on the ClearNet, a virtual private network, which creates a protected tunnel for communications, and the dark web? Why bother with the dark web if you can have a VPN?
Well, in principle, they kind of offer the same protections if that's what you're trying to do. You're aiming for that. If you're to use the Tor network, I think one of the few advantages that the Tor network provides, other than a VPN, is or over a VPN, is that you have more encrypted hops occurring, and there's less of a chance for a misconfiguration to ultimately be your downfall in making your presence known or making your identity known. But really, in principle, it's they're kind of doing the same thing to create an encrypted tunnel where somebody can't snoop your traffic. However, that's if you're wanting to use Tor, for instance, in a legitimate manner. Obviously, as we've been discussing this entire time, there's a whole other underbelly side that kind of comes along with that.
So I think what you're saying is that there may be some legitimate uses for the dark web or Tor browsers, and one of them might be, for instance, if you're living in a repressive regime where there is very, very strict control or surveillance on what happens on the internet, that you might use that to communicate. You might use a Tor browser to communicate and hide yourself from authorities who might otherwise be looking to arrest you for saying something that doesn't agree with the political regime in power at the time. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, and that is definitely correct. The evolution of Tor, for instance, since we're picking on Tor, we'll do a deep dive on that. The evolution of Tor, from what it was initially created for to kind of what it's become today, is really an interesting and storied one. So Tor itself is a non-for-profit organization that operates on the principles of maintaining and providing a platform for people to remain anonymous and have all of their communications and browsing habits and traffic completely encrypted. Really for that exact reason, either whether it be an oppressive regime or just somebody who's overall privacy conscious. They have this platform, and that's available to them to kind of to do that and maintain that. However, with all of those things put in place, that also attracts a very different type of crowd. If you've got somebody saying, "Oh yeah, hey, I can talk and I can browse and I can be completely anonymous on this platform, and this is all you have to do to get on it, and it's super fast and it's great." Somebody's going to take listen to that and take notice to that and be like, "Oh, hey, wait a minute, I could potentially move my criminal and nebulous affairs onto this platform and take advantage of what the platform is trying to offer for legitimate users for my criminal purposes." And that's really where it came from and how it has evolved into this big black hole that we think of it now today.
We talked about a few things before the session, before our podcast, and people usually think about what the dark web stands for, and it would be contraband, child porn and drugs and other sorts of illicit things that if they were sold in the open would result in an arrest and imprisonment. But But from what I hear from you, you have a slightly different objective in accessing and navigating through the dark web. And why don't you talk a little bit about that and what that means for your everyday activity and how you see this evolving over time?
Well, kind of going back to what I was just saying. Really, I think the best way to look at Tor and the technology behind it and what it's offering, and what it does is it's really just a tool. And like any tool, the manner in which the tool is utilized, the way you use it, is completely up to the individual. So I find it to be kind of ironic that there was this safe haven opened up for people to kind of talk and freely and privately and anonymously, and to be able to browse to wherever they wanted to, completely anonymous, and kind of go from there to what it is today of, yeah, you can still do that, but there's this huge criminal aspect to it. And so really, I think the best way to kind of sum it up is it's just a tool, and it's really up to the individual on how they utilize it.
And the way, from what I understand, the way you utilize it at Silent is to obtain intelligence. Is that right?
Right. No, definitely. So there's a lot of because so actually, you know what? Let me step back for a second. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So because you have these ripe conditions for it becoming a platform to harbor criminal interests and criminal activity, a lot of today's cyber criminals have moved their operations, whether it be communications or malware development, or anything kind of like that. They have moved their entire operations to the dark web. So for myself and my colleagues as security practitioners, to stay kind of current on some of the latest threat intelligence, what's being talked about, what's being cooked up in the kitchens of these criminals, if you will, these cyber criminals. What kind of malware are we going to be seeing? How can we stay ahead of the trends? And really, that's one of the big parts of the intelligence that we look to gather from the dark web and kind of glean from our time working within the cesspool, if you will.
We're going to take another quick break, and when we return, we will talk more about the dark web. We'll talk about Google. We'll talk about indexing and ways in which you might want to maybe traverse the dark web. We're here with Jake Simpson from the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Cyber Law Now. I'm Stephen Tepler, and I'm here with Jake Simpson from the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida, and we're talking about the dark web. Jake, we talked about how you might access the dark web. We talked about how there's a Chrome version of accessing portions of the dark web and the types of crime, the types of criminal activity that might happen. But you as a primer, let's talk about why the dark web is so, I guess, disorganized. You mentioned something about it not being indexed. And my understanding about indexing is that this is what Google does with the entire internet. And so when you do a search query with Google, you are basically searching an indexed version of the internet that Google is providing to you on its search engine. Do you want to explain a little bit about what that's all about and tell us why Google wouldn't crawl the dark web?
No, it's definitely a great question. So yeah, you're completely right in saying that's exactly what Google does. Is Google, and it's actually not necessarily just Google. Just about every major search engine out there, Bing, Yahoo, Baidu, Yandex, DuckDuckGo, and Google. I mean, I could keep going on. They each have these different spiders, as we'll call it, that will go out and essentially spider sites and crawl the sites and index them. That way, when you type in a query of hey, I want to go to Amazon, and it says, okay, here's where Amazon is located, and you can go to Amazon that way through a Google search. That's really made a huge convenience for us in our day-to-day lives, and how we operate the internet and how we operate on the ClearNet. Unfortunately, on the dark web, Google doesn't crawl. And Google doesn't crawl the dark web, one, because the way Google spiders are currently set up, they would have to make network changes and configuration changes to be able to even access the networks to crawl. So that would be changing from your typical ClearNet operation into adding in some sort of plugin that would allow you to get onto the dark web. Now, Google also kind of stays away from it just because generally when somebody is trying to search for something, you don't want to direct everyday traffic to things on the dark web, because the dark web is inherently risky. There's no telling what you're going to track back in if you go perusing out there. So there are, however, a few search engines on the dark web that specialize in just kind of indexing and more specifically indexing the Tor network, and kind of going out and searching for those things out there. One of them is Not Evil. That's what the actual search engine's called. There's another one called Ahama. Harry's is another really good one. And Graham's is probably the last really good Tor-based dark web spider that will kind of index and be as a search engine. But a lot of the sites that are actually worth writing home about, the criminal enclaves, in my perspective, the criminal enclaves where they hang out, where they talk, where they peddle wares, where they trade malware. A lot of that is protected and are set up correctly by their web administrators, if you will, to prevent them from being indexed even by the dark web spiders. So you still have to be able to go and you have to know where they are and figure out where they're at to be able to navigate to them.
These are like speakeasies in the old days, right? You had to know where they were. You had to know to knock 3 times in a certain pattern, and maybe you'd gain entry. Wow. Well, we've learned a lot about the dark web in these past 2 podcasts. We've learned that it's a dark and dangerous place where drug dealing, contraband, stolen identities, email passwords, proprietary information from companies, and ever so much more can be obtained using bartering through cryptocurrencies, and pretty much done in an anonymous fashion. Although what we've understood from Jake today is that you may not be as anonymous as you might think on the dark web, and that there are some investigative experts out there who are trolling the dark web to find out information for their clients, for law enforcement, and even for the federal government. Jake Simpson from the Silent Group, I want to thank you so much for spending so much time educating our listeners about the dark web and the dangers of the dark web, and giving them some insights that probably they haven't heard and won't heard on your everyday podcast. This is Steve Tepler, the cyber lawyer on the Cyber Law Now podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember to hit subscribe, get all your podcasts while you sleep, share them with your friends. And if you have a cyber law subject you want to hear more about, contact us at cyberlawnow.com. Jake, thanks so much again for joining us. And until next time, this is Stephen Tepler on the Cyber Law Now podcast.